Welcome to University Place Presents. I'm Norman Gilliland. I'm having my usual pre-season panic attack. I'm feeling unprepared both in scores and in sleep, but then I suppose this is the normal annual condition. So said Leonard Bernstein about the difficulties of being a conductor at the beginning of a season. So many things to think about and so many things to worry about. When a performance goes well, it's easy for the audience to assume that it's all flowing naturally, and yet there is a lot of preparation and, yes, a lot of anxiety behind preparing a concert, let alone a concert series. And who could tell us more about that than my guest? Welcome to University Place Presents, longtime conductor of the Madison Symphony, John DeMain.
Hi, Norman. Great to be here.
Last time we talked about your long musical history, and even from early childhood and then your early conducting experiences and how naturally that seemed to be for you the thing to do, despite some of the challenges, of course, that would apply to any conductor. But when you make the transition from Texas, Houston, to Madison, what kind of complications arose in your career, which was already well established at that point?
Well, I was on the verge in Houston of trying to expand my career more internationally, and some of actually, I was planning to conduct some Toscas in Bonn, and the intendant of that particular theater was actually arrested and for overspending the stipend, that the government gives, and so my performances were canceled, and that never happened. But I had been at Houston for 18 years, and I thought, I don't want to just be in one place my entire life. And I had started actually in doing a lot of symphonic. Well, the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra was, there was a symphonic path, and before that, the Norwalk Symphony. And so I had this, and I suddenly changed, direction with the offer to go to to Houston Grand Opera, the Texas Opera Theater. So, and I found that the more I had a reputation, and I had a lot of success with the world premieres and Porgy and Bess and all of that, the more I was being tapped as an opera conductor, and the harder it was to get anybody to take me seriously as a symphony conductor. I did have a shot at the Omaha Symphony, and the search committee told me that I would have won that position, but the outgoing president of the board jumped the search before it was finished and panicked and hired somebody else, and that was upsetting to the orchestra and me. But anyway, they have a wonderful result as of all those years in my time in Omaha and Houston. So it was, but I was beginning to get really frustrated because Mahler didn't write any operas, and they did Bruckner. So I mean, there were just so many composers that you want to get your hands on, and it was impossible to. And so I thought, I can do this. I really want to have a symphony orchestra. How can I do it? And I thought, well, at 45 years of age, or 47, I think, at the time I came here, I was not going to get the New York Philharmonic, let's be honest, because I didn't have any track record leading up to that symphonically in a major way. And it's interesting because I think if you're 19 years old and you do you suddenly jump in and you do a Brahms symphony, everybody goes, oh, wow, wow, wow. But if you're 47 years old and you're suddenly doing your Brahms symphony for the first time, they go, who are you kidding? Because those guys have been playing that for all those years, over and over, almost every other season, they're playing the same pieces. They want somebody to come in who's really has been around the block with these pieces and has fresh ideas or whatever, So that reality was very clear to me. So I wanted to go somewhere where it was professional, where I could make a difference. Hopefully I could make a difference. And so that I was not, I didn't want to be in front of an amateur orchestra. That would have been too much of a change from what I was doing in my opera world, because I had the Houston Symphony in the pit. I had, Seattle Symphony when I was in Seattle. I had, great orchestras to work with all the time. So, but it was interesting when I applied to come here, because the search was being handled by Madison Area Technical College, because at that time the symphony and the technical college had a relationship, because Roland Johnson, my predecessor, taught there, you know, and was very close friends with the president, I'm told, of the college, and it was kind of disconcerting because I had a question, you know, and I would call to ask about something about, you know, the guest conducting and the whole thing. And these students would answer the phone, and they had not a clue as to who a conductor was or what he was, you know, and I thought, what am I getting myself into? But what I did was I came up to see Shining Bough. You know, Roland wanted to have a world premiere under his belt before he retired, and everybody found the right thing, Frank Lloyd Wright, the story that happened to him out at Taliesin and in Spring Green, and I came up to see it, and I was very impressed with the level of production. Of course, Stephen Wadsworth had directed it, and he's a very fine director, and I guess Madison Opera spent a little bit of money on that production because it really looked good. And the orchestra played well. I remember at the time, I thought the winds and brass were terrific, and I thought the strings were dicey. But I thought I could make a difference. But the way I would rehearse, because I've had that situation before, and you know, let's see where this goes. So it's interesting. They gave me the first guest of the three guests that they brought in. I was the first one, and on my program was the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony. And of course, this season we've had Michael Stern conducting the Shostakovich Fifth Symphony. So that was, and then there were. In January, when they sat down to meet, they remembered me because, you know, I thought, are they going to remember me because the last person, you know, is the freshest in your mind? But they did, and they offered me the job. So when you say the challenges, well, first of all, what I did when I came here is I sat down with the search committee, in which there were some players on the search committee, and I said to them, what would you like the next music director to do? Because I thought, you know, why not find out what they want, what they hope for? And they did not want me to come in there and fire everybody and throw everybody out. They said, just make us play better, is what they told me.
That's nicely humble.
Yeah, nicely humble. And so I thought, okay, that gives me, you know, some framework to come in. Because you're walking into an orchestra that you don't know. In fact, it's only in recent years that I discovered the history of how this became a professional orchestra. Because we're about to celebrate our centennial. When this orchestra started out, it was not paid. It was a community orchestra, and Roland was the one who converted to being paid. And I didn't realize that the principal players that played in the orchestra when I got there never took an audition.
Oh, that seems to be a little bit of an oversight.
Well, it would be today. It would be impossible because the contract wouldn't allow it. But he was creating this orchestra. So he offered the principal chairs to the heads of the department at the university. And the university hired really good people. So he was getting first-class musicians in those chairs. And you know, a few of them are still there, but you know, a lot of them are retired now. But that was the nucleus for building the orchestra. The string section, just to try to get enough string players. You know, this program wasn't that strong at the time. The players weren't that strong. You know, so that was a challenge. So anyway, you come in there, you figure, well, how am I supposed to know how to seat people and where to put people and all of that? So I suggested that I audition the string section, not make it mandatory, but just sort of get an idea, you know, and I made a couple changes, and most of the people went along with it, but there was one particular person who had a real problem, and her friends got after her, and so she lasted a season, and then she quit, which was fine. But most of it was painless, and it was helpful. And so we started, and I remember, you know, talking about auditions. And they were now auditioning, but not behind a screen.
Which is usual today.
Which is usual.
These anonymous auditions.
Yes, anonymous. You don't want to know the sex, you don't want to know the age, you don't want to know the color, nothing. You just don't, you know, just hear them play the instrument. And that was interesting because I think that what happened was fiefdoms were created. You know, like the heads of the departments of the university when you needed a third trumpet or you needed a third oboe or whatever you needed, they chose their best students to come in and play. So I perceived it to be what I would call a closed shop. And that was fine, but that's not what the orchestra of the city should be about. So the first thing I announced was we were going to do blind auditions, because that's what I had been exposed to, even at the opera. The other jobs I had, always, blind auditions. And so, and they went belligerent at first. They were furious with me, But when they saw how I did it, which was we pick the winner, we'd see who they were, and if there was some reason why there was a problem, like they shouldn't play because they're difficult to work with or something like that, we let that come to the surface. We had, they realized that they could make input. But it sort of worked. I mean, it worked right from the beginning. But it was interesting when these string players took their auditions, because they'd come in and the sort of good ones at the university would play their concerto, and some of it would be in tune, and they'd get around the instrument really well.
Good start.
Yeah, it's a good start. But when they would play, so the way you do an orchestral audition is, and actually it's prescribed, the excerpts that each instrument will be asked to play at an audition, and most orchestras adhere to that. So it's really the things that will expose the difficulties of the instrument. I mean, it might be 32 bars of a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart symphony. It might, of course, you're always going to have Ein Heldenleben or
Yes,
Don Juan or one of
Richard
these
Strauss,
incredibly difficult things to play on the violin. And so that's what's there. Well, when they would get to those excerpts and play, they would all crash and burn. I mean, they're beautiful vibratos. Now, I mean, it was terrible. It was awful. And so I remember at my first rehearsal, I stood up at the podium, and I just looked at it and I said, if you want your students to play in this orchestra, tell them that the excerpts are more important than the concerto. So the next year, because, if you're not willing to practice your orchestra part, you don't belong in an orchestra, because you will pull it down. And so everybody's got to realize, because everybody wants to be Heifetz, but when you play in that orchestra, those parts are hard, and if you don't practice, next year everybody practiced, and then. So I think that was the challenge, and also the string section wasn't full size, and so I asked if it'd be possible to have 16, 14, naively, I mean, there's a lot of cities in the United States that don't have 16 firsts, 14 seconds, 12 violas, 10 cellos, and 8 basses. But I didn't care about that. I wanted to see if I could have so they said, yeah, if you can find them, we'll let you do it. So I found them. And I always pay tribute to John Stevens when he was dean over at the university, because he really believed in developing the string department, and they've, of course, those excellent players in the pro arte and some of the individual teachers that were there, that good students started coming there, and the level was growing. But it was still, our principal source of musicians was still the University of Wisconsin. That was the principal source. But as word got out that the orchestra was, getting better and playing, we weren't, mitigating the repertoire. We were playing whatever we wanted to play. I just found a way to rehearse it. My first concert, Mahler Symphony No. 1. So then people started coming in from Chicago and from the from the outlying areas, and that was really great. And I'll remember, we had Martha and Rich Blum, who used to be in the Pro Arte Quartet, and she was principal second, and he was principal viola. And I think it was about the third year or fourth year that I was here. And the auditions were so good that we had plenty of people for the first violins, and we could actually put people of that level in the second violin section. And at the first rehearsal, she jumped up and she said, "Oh my God, I have a section behind me." And that's what started to transform the orchestra. And now today, they come in from all over the country.
But you make a distinction, don't you, between what you'd call a weekly orchestra and then a kind of an ad hoc orchestra paid by the service.
Right. So in Europe, every city has a full-time orchestra that, with retirement benefits, health, insurance, the whole thing, all paid for by the municipality, all paid for by the government. Now they have, according to the size of the city, different level orchestras. An A orchestra would be a 96-piece orchestra. A B orchestra might be a few less players. A C orchestra might be 72 players in a smaller town. But it's full-time, fully professional, and supported by the government. In America, our full-time orchestras are in cities that have over 1 million population. You know, so you have the, Philadelphia, Houston, Detroit, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. Of course, there's more than ever now full-time orchestras in these big cities all over the United States. That wasn't the case 100 years ago, but that's the way it is, now. And so in a city like the size of Madison, we have a fully professional orchestra. The orchestra is paid every time they sit down to rehearse or play. They're just not on a weekly. And actually, years ago, was the schedule that we play is the same schedule that the Cleveland Orchestra played, that the Pittsburgh Symphony played before this idea happened. Most of it happened in the 1960s, where Ford Foundation came in and was really infusing a lot of money and creating these full-time orchestras all over the country. And so, but we have a wonderful model because it's a model that is sustainable financially, as well as it's really good for creativity because there's no burnout. The 52-week orchestras have to be careful of burnout. As a matter of fact, when Michael Stern was here, we talked about the differences of these orchestras, and that the orchestra that he had for 20 years, Kansas, had a 42-week season, and they said there were people saying, well, can't you make it to 52 weeks? And he said, no. He said, I wouldn't trade those 10 weeks off for anything because that's what keeps the musicians from getting burnout, and they can't wait to get back and play, and they're fresh and they're ready to go again. So those are some of the little inside trade-offs on all of that.
How is it all financed, though? I mean, because we do hear occasionally, of course, about orchestras that get in trouble. Toronto, I think, was one not too long ago, for example. Green Bay disappeared entirely after 100 years or so. And so these things do have their day.
Well, the challenge is, I think, is to connect with the community. Because in America, everything is, we have ticket sales, we have contributed income, we have sometimes some government and some, a little bit of help from foundations and that kind of thing. But it's mostly people giving us donations, and big ones, as well as the ticket sales. And I think that, there have been certain cities, I think, where, you could have a bad board, you could have bad fundraising, because, fundraising is such a big piece of this, and so you have a director of development, Casey Oakers, with the Madison Symphony. She's brilliant, and, we do fabulous with our fundraising. And so, and it's very different because I joke all the time that when I was conducting, like the year that I came here, and Barbara was moving into the house, my wife at the time, before she passed away, she was moving into the house, and I was guest conducting an opera in Nice. And of course, it's subsidized by the government. So my lunch every day was at the commissary with the garbage collectors and everybody else, and for $2 or $3, I ate like a king,
Sure.
And but there were no parties, there were no development functions because there was no need to raise money. There was no opening night party. This is all the stuff that we're totally used to in America.
You don't quite have the ups and downs that
No.
you would have with an American orchestra.
No, I mean, but you don't meet the people you're playing for. You can live in an ivory tower, go do your performance, and then disappear. So I remember opening night of Attila, Verdi's Attila is what I was conducting. The head of Glyndebourne, Brian Dickey, who then was at Chicago Opera Theater for years in Toronto, he came and just to see the show, and so we went out to a bar and got drunk afterwards, and celebrated opening night. But that was so different, and so I always tell our donors, I said, in Europe, you only have to be nice to the deputy mayors who dole out your subsidy every year. I said, here, I have to be nice to all of you. But it's so great because, especially when you're in a town like Madison, Wisconsin, the background of these people who come to the symphony, who has a Nobel Prize, who has a patent, there's just such a wealth of interesting people that are in so many different fields and who love music and want to make music a part of their lives, classical music.
And so you as a selector of the music, I would think would be a little bit more, correct me if I'm wrong, but a little bit more constrained than one of those European conductors where the income is guaranteed for the organization. They wouldn't have to rely quite so much on ticket sales, and ticket sales being a significant part, not just of the income, but of also the kind of the public relations for a symphony, rely those sales on certain pieces that are draws.
Right. Well, let's just back up for a second. The last part of the 20th century, the big mantra was subscriptions. And I can't think of his name at Chicago Symphony, but he was the sort of godfather of the idea of subscriptions are king.
Guaranteed income, at least for a year at a time.
Income. And an audience, guaranteed audience. You know, so you know, you're doing 8 concerts a year, and somebody takes eight and they get their seats. They year after year, and so we were filling the concert halls with subscribers, and then some single tickets. All of a sudden, that has completely reversed, and today, the way things are going today, subscriptions are not a part of the future.
Why would that be?
Because people don't want to make a commitment a year in advance to what they're going to be doing on Saturday night. And that's what, you know, I mean, when you think about it, you go back to 1950 in the New York Philharmonic, they were doing, 32 concerts a year or whatever, and people went every Saturday night. That's what they did. And you didn't have to have, 4,000 people for 2 performances, 6,000 people for 3 performances. The same people came back all the time. So your audience was maybe only 6,000 people in a city of 10 million.
But you could rely on them.
But you could rely on them. Then when things started to change, they started doing half seasons, then quarter seasons, and then they had to exponentially grow the audience. So they started doing pops events and, and all different kinds of events, because especially if you're trying to finance a 52-week orchestra with pension and health and all of those things that go with it, and recordings
salaries.
And the salaries, full-time salaries. So there's a big difference in the nut that Milwaukee has to raise every year and what we have to raise, even though we're now at 7 million, but still, most of the major orchestras look from 32 million to 70 or 80 million a year that they have to raise to be able to sustain that. So that's a challenge. But that's the American system as opposed to the European system. And if it ever changed overnight in Europe, everything would fall apart because there's no history of private giving.
Not since Beethoven's time.
Not since Beethoven's time, right? With the monarchies.
Yeah, the benefactors. Mm-hmm.
Well, they were the government in a way.
No, that's true. They were. They were just absolute government.
Absolute government. So they did. I think nothing has changed.
Goes around, comes around, and all that. But getting back to the repertory, how does that need to sell a certain number of tickets determine what you, John DeMain, as the artistic director and conductor of Madison Symphony, how does it affect what you select? Not just the repertory, but of course the soloists too.
Well, it's changing. I mean, it's changing because, first of all, for example, single ticket sales. Both the opera and the symphony are currently experiencing a huge ticket sale on the day of the actual concert or the day before. So you're going into these programs not knowing whether anybody's going to come. And sometimes they don't, sometimes they do. That's a change. So then you're trying to say, well, okay, what's going to get them in? Because now we don't, because with a subscription, a guaranteed audience, you sort of play whatever you want. You still, if you want them to renew, you still have got to give them the reason why they fell in love with symphonic music.
A lot of it has to do with brand names, doesn't it?
Yeah,
obviously.
sure. I mean,
familiar things.
I mean, Beethoven, but don't forget there was all of that European migration to America, and all of that history in those people's lives, and work, and and I look at during the Second World War when all the Jewish people came over here, and I mean, for them, their very soul depended on hearing classical music and opera. I mean, it was nourishment for their soul, and their life was bereft without it. Today, we're looking at several generations now who have, not necessarily here, I mean, Madison has music education in the schools and in the outlying areas, but so many pockets around the country do not have music education in the schools. And so when those people come and move here, they don't have that in their background. They don't need it. They don't know about classical music. So we're facing now a whole couple generations that have not had the benefit of music education, or and so how do we reach them? And not only that, but as an organization, most symphony orchestras and opera companies had been remiss where equity, diversity, and inclusion was concerned. So all of that is revolutionizing the approach that we are taking. But still, I mean, our musicians trained to play hard stuff, right? I mean, horn players want to play Mahler and Bruckner and Strauss and those, and we want to, and Beethoven is just, I mean, you can't say symphony without saying Beethoven, I mean, and Beethoven, and all of these masterpieces, they continue to be masterpieces. There's nothing has made Beethoven less than Beethoven.
Yeah, and it's true, and you could look at it on paper and say, oh, Pastoral Symphony, ho-hum, but then when you get there, it wins you over all over again.
Oh, it's so brilliant. I mean, what he had a way of connecting, I think, with the common man, and still wrote very complex music, but his melodies and the fact that he had a voice, you always know when you're listening to Beethoven, or most of the time.
A lot of times it sounds like you're listening to an anthem.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just phenomenal. So I think that, and those are the reasons why people fell in love with music. They would hear these pieces and they'd fall in love with them. And I think we also went through a very bad patch in the second half, I've said before, in the second half of the 20th century, with a lot of ugly music, and music that was designed not to have any form, shape, or recognizable thing to it that for an audience to hook into, and following a kind of philosophy that these composers are writing for themselves and screw the audience.
Yeah, and that does raise a whole interesting approach, doesn't it? Because you could say that music is either written for the composer, or for the performer, or for the audience.
Right.
Sometimes it's all three. Sometimes, as you say, John, it's just for the composer or just for the performer.
Well, I think when you look back in history, when composers wrote pieces and they weren't successful, they were devastated. Bizet was devastated that Carmen wasn't a hit the first time it played. Rachmaninoff went to a deep depression.
Yes, before he got hypnotized.
So they wanted to connect with their audience. I always like to remind everybody that I think that Beethoven is the father of serious listening, because we use this idea, this terrible term, classical music. What does that mean? Because we write a piece yesterday, so suddenly it's classical. It's concert music, and those opening chords of Eroica, bump, bump. It's sort of like, stop talking, listen up. We're going on a journey. And he really was the one who we started moving into the concert halls and started really listening at the compositions, and that developed from there. So Beethoven for me is, the icon of symphonic music, even though we have Haydn and Mozart and all of that. But what Beethoven did with those 9 symphonies was just, extraordinary. But it was also the whole idea of how you experienced a concert, and how you didn't casually have a drink and walk around like you did in the Renaissance and
or in Beethoven's time, for that matter, too often. Yeah, I mean, there's a wonderful story about him. I think he was just playing solo for some high-rolling patrons and their friends. They were chatting as he played, and he got up and said, "For solche Schweinen spiele ich nicht. I will not play for such pigs," and walked out. So,
on the other hand, there's been big discussion recently about whether we should applaud in between movements.
And that is an interesting phenomenon. Now, let me give you my 2 cents worth before you tell us what the
my
real
2
story.
cents worth.
Yeah, more than that. I tend to think of applause, and usually, of course, the composer doesn't expect, or the performer, applause in between movements of a 3 or 4 minute movement concerto or symphony, for example, or a suite for that matter. However, and the audience doesn't really, a really familiar audience will not applaud between movements. However, if you hear applause between movements, to me, it implies that those are people who are fairly new to classical music. And to me, then it's a positive thing.
Yes, but I also think that this idea of not applauding, so I didn't realize until recently that so often after the second movement of a concerto, in a three-movement concerto, it says on the bottom, attacca, which means go right to the third movement. It doesn't say that after the first movement. And we know historically that they didn't play the second and third movements right after they played the first
They put other stuff in between.
Right, and if you listen to the endings of first movements, they demand applause.
Well,
so
right, they're so dramatic.
The Grieg, I mean, how cruel it is to play the finale of the first movement of the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto to silence. So, I mean, I think the time has come. You feel like applauding, applaud. But you don't, so don't applaud after the slow second movement. I think the idea of not applauding between movements really should go to the idea that when song cycles and things have a theme and you're trying to create, this, that you don't interrupt it with this noise and you allow this whole thing to affect you and take over, right? But I think it's a little different with concertos, and I think symphonies you probably don't have to applaud as much, but concertos are designed to dazzle.
Well, of course, what is it, Tchaikovsky's sixth that ends
yes,
next to the last movement very
right.
dramatically.
Right.
Everybody applauds, and then
yeah.
guess what? There's a quiet finale.
Well, because that's what it does to you, and so applaud. What are we being fussy about, Come and have a good time.
Well, and I would think that given your extensive operatic background, you would particularly feel that way, John, because in opera, hit the high note, everybody applauds, they go crazy,
right,
everything stops. Yeah, it's a storyline, but
right.
It's a different kind of conduct.
And in some instances, encores.
well, right. Yes. Let's hear that again. Mm-hmm.
Right. But I think But you're right. We're trying to get new people in, and I think I think it's important when you have these single ticket sales that you still do interesting work. But I think it's important to make sure that you have something that the audience recognizes on the cutting. At least that's some of the advice I've been given recently. Make sure that there's something that they know, and then they'll give you a break on listening to something they don't know, and maybe find out that it's really interesting and intriguing. So, but we're trying to figure this out, because I do think that with the dawn of single ticket sales actually growing to the extent that they are, and subscriptions eroding for social reasons, more than anything, that it's demanding that we look at repertoire. But repertoire changes over time. When you look at the operas that the Metropolitan Opera was doing in 1900 and 1950 and what they're doing today, there's certain pieces that were in vogue, that went out of fashion, came back in. Certain pieces have always been there, but there's repertoire changes. And so I think we have to look at the symphonic world the same way. And also I think we have to do our own job of maybe trying to help our audiences know how to listen to this music. I mean, I'm pushing for. I'm sort of blasphemous, but I'm sort of pushing that we close circuit, televise our concerts, so when an audience is sitting there, it looks like when they're watching Final Forte at home, and when the pianist is playing, the whole audience can watch his hands if they want to, and when the oboist is playing, you actually could see the oboe, and the way we do for so we would help people, journey through the music and give their eyes something to do, because life is different. And when I've proposed this idea over the years, the older generation is really content to sit there and just listen. But that's not the way the new generation is growing up. Visuals are a part of their experience. And so that's something that I think we need to look at for the future.
There are ensembles, the North Corner Chamber Orchestra, for example, and I think also Portland Baroque out in Oregon, if I remember right, will actually stream their concerts.
Stream their concerts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so live streaming, and sure, you know, you might have potential audience that would be sitting at home instead of in the hall, where you, I assume, get more excited as performers if you have a full house.
Well, we haven't, we finally have a contract now, a media agreement, that will allow us for streaming. During COVID, we couldn't stream music. We could stream anybody could talk, but nobody could play a note because we did not have an agreement with our musicians for streaming. Before COVID, we never saw the need for it. And so in a way, we were caught with our pants down. So now we have the ability to do it, but we don't want to shoot ourselves in the foot. We still want buns and seats, as we say.
That's right.
And so, but people who have been going to hear us for years, and now maybe they're in a long-term facility, where they can't travel anymore and all of that. The idea for them being able to see and hear something that they really loved all their lives, that's terrific. And also the idea of maybe taking an education concert that you're doing, and you could send it to some place in northern Wisconsin that might not have an opportunity to hear this kind of thing. You can, there's a lot of potential for streaming.
What does the Madison Symphony do for outreach, though? I mean, if there is somebody up in Minocqua or Solon Springs or someplace who's not likely to come to Madison, or we'll even say Milwaukee, for a symphony, how do you bring the music to them, live music? Do you have smaller ensembles that go out as kind of missionary groups to spread the word?
Well, we've been doing a little bit recently with some community concerts in our own area, but we haven't gone way out of town, But we're doing some where we take the orchestra to different group areas. And of course, I think Final Forte has statewide, and that's really good. And I think we want to do a little bit more, try to do a little bit more with that sort of thing. But we don't really. I mean, we're pretty much focused on, the Dane County and this sort of southwestern region, and so we're not really doing much right now, I don't think, to try to get people up and...
I suppose you do have to kind of identify your target audience there.
And also because it's costly. I mean, to stream, it's not free. I mean, the musicians have to be paid, and so, and then, how much do you charge people to be able to stream? Sure. Is everything free? Or, so I think we're still at the dawn of that, you know what I mean? I just think we're at the beginning of how to do all of that.
How do you go about, as again, you're the one selecting the music, how do you go about selecting a soloist? Do you decide first, I want to hear the Grieg Piano Concerto, or do you decide, I want to hear Garrick Oldson?
No, I want to hear Garrick Oldson. Mm-hmm. I don't care what he plays. No, I do care what he plays. I'm just kidding. No, I want to hear him. So I think, over the years, the Madison Symphony has as part of their endowment, the Steenbach, I think, gift or something, was one of those gifts in the endowment was to bring in important guest artists. And Roland had great soloists. Well, my predecessor, he brought some really fine artists here. And so that's always been a part of our mix. But I think what we do is, we let the agents know. The whole idea of artists' agents has changed too, because some of these big artists now, their agents are based in London, based in Europe, because the American scene has gone much more pop and much more, Columbia Artists is not the Columbia Artists it was 25, 30 years ago.
It was quite the
right
enterprise.
Sure.
Releasing a lot of recordings.
So now we've got to negotiate with an agent in London and hope that he has that artist's European or international schedule as well as and getting them to come. So what we do is once we get our dates in Overture Hall, and we try to keep them pretty consistent every year about the sort of week that they're going to fall on. Every now and then we have to get out of their way if they're going to bring in a Lion King or a Wicked or Hamilton or some big show that they can sell a month worth of tickets, and then we work around that because we want them to be successful. But so we get the dates, and then there's agents that we like to deal with, but not exclusively. But we let the big agencies know, and that we can afford to pay basically for any soloist who wants to come here. Not on a one-night, one-off. We don't want that.
Because you do 3 concerts,
we do 3.
Friday, Saturday night, and Sunday afternoon.
Right, and we want the artist to come and play for all 3. Because if we so we don't, so we shy away from single performances. We do them from time to time, but we shy away from that because usually that's a gala and that's a very expensive ticket prices, and then they don't come to the next subscription concert. So you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. And we built up this audience, which is today a challenge since COVID, but we built up our audiences by having this artist play for all three performances. When I got here, we were doing Saturday nights, 8 Saturday nights. 7 in Christmas, which was more like a Pops concert. And then I had always, when I was at Houston Grand Opera, I always loved the Sunday matinee performance. There was something about that audience. They were rested. They were there to hear the music. It was the last thing they were going to do before they prepared for the week, and they were already put last week behind them. So it was a great audience. And I thought, we've got this lousy weather in the winter here in Madison, and people don't want to drive home at late at night on a Saturday night, and besides, there's a lot of revelers out there on a Saturday night. So I said we should do a Sunday matinee. So the first year I did the Beethoven Ninth and Christmas. I repeated those two on Sunday. The next year I added 2 more, and the next year 2 more, and then by the 4th year, we were offering subscription, and we had 300 or 400 people to start with, and then it really took off. And now Sunday afternoon's our biggest audience.
Let's talk a little bit about demographics then. I mean, you might see the numbers behind the scenes, but you're out there on the stage facing that audience, addressing them often, usually, in fact, at the beginning of a concert and maybe at the beginning of the second part. Do you have a sense of, is the audience collectively aging? Are you filling it in? Is it kind of picking up younger audiences in significant numbers?
I think opera is. I think in the recent...
Getting younger audiences.
Yeah, absolutely. It's visual. The Barber of Seville had a lot of young people, which we had just done, this past year. And Candide had a lot of young people. No, I mean, we're seeing younger people at the... I think it's important to remember that back in 1950, I think it was, the Chicago Symphony surveyed
this research, yes,
the audience, and they found out that the audience was the age that the audience is today. There's no difference.
Yeah.
And I feel that it's very important that kids in college have a really good experience as part of their education, learning about opera, learning about symphony, Broadway, whatever, jazz, whatever they do, and whatever they do while they're dating, having really good date nights. Then they get married and they have kids. What do you have to do? You got to go to all those kids' concerts and all their games and all of that, and everything costs money, and so with exception, people don't do the things they did when they were courting. They're doing the things that they need to do to raise a family and hopefully giving these kids a good chance. So my theory is that once they're out of the nest and actually after college is paid for, there you're looking at people who are now 55, 60 years old. They have some discretionary income now, and they'll go back to doing the things they did when they were younger. The problem is that if those people don't have any music education, they're not going to go back to going to symphony concerts if they don't have any classical music education, So, yeah. But or we have to entice them to try it out and to experience it. And so we're looking right now at the idea of how can we make going to a concert an event? Because the other thing that happened with COVID is that people found out that they could entertain themselves without ever leaving their home.
To a certain extent, anyway. After 2 or 3 years, you would think maybe they were eager to get back out.
Well, you'd think they would. I mean, I would imagine that if you're in that older age group and you have a pre-existing condition, you're wary of being in public spaces. And I think I don't know that scientifically, but I know it anecdotally, that there are people who are not coming right now because they don't want to be in a public space. It doesn't seem to bother young people, though. Rock concerts are packed and all of that.
So true.
But that's different with an older group that feel more, health threatened.
Well, the one thing about the opera, I'm just hypothetically thinking here, though, is more so than a symphony concert. In addition to being something beautiful, an opera, for the most part, is also, you can look at it as an athletic event. Because it demands such, power and accuracy and timing and finesse and presence.
You are so right. I always said two things. Opera is your life sung back at you, and opera is the Olympics of singing. Those are the two things that I think make opera special. Yeah, you have to develop, you're not hearing that kind of singing, on the airwaves.
Right.
And so it might be kind of a shock. But usually when you go and you realize there are no microphones out there, and these people make this giant sound by just, what they do with their physiognomy, to be able to do all that, it's just amazing. But it's the same thing. The problem is caring. We know that there's a big difference between live performance and recorded performance. But when you have fabulous recording equipment in your house, and I think it's a problem. I think we experience too much of life now virtually.
Yes, you certainly make because more all the time.
You sit in front of that TV set and play endless games and have all these fabulous visuals. And there's great music a lot of times going on at the same time. But, it's virtual. And so we've got to make going to a live concert an event that has a wonderful aura to it, from the time you walk in, time you leave home until the time you go home, basically. And what is it like when you walk into that lobby? What can we do after those concerts are over? What can we, so that you don't want to miss it? So we're introducing an idea for the centennial, which I'm not allowed to say just yet. But I think with young people, I don't think we should worry too much about that. We know that the audience is made up of people who have a relationship with music. So, you look at WISO, you look at the Madison Youth Choirs, you look at all these wonderful things for youth in this city, and they do come to the concerts as well. But by the same token, if you don't have any contact, if you never sang in a choir, you didn't take a piano lesson, then how do you become attracted to what we do? And how can we make you attractive to what we do?
You make it a social event.
Make it a social event. And I think also maybe we do some music appreciation online. I think we could do more of that. Not just playing a piece, but actually giving sort of classes of musical appreciation.
Which, of course, you do, but on site with the pre-concert talks and also your introductions to some of the pieces, especially the contemporary ones. Another component of this draw, though, I would say, would be the venue itself, and that would be, in the case of the Madison Symphony, the Overture Center for the Arts. And 2004, I believe, was inaugurated.
We are celebrating our 20th anniversary being in that hall.
And you were, to some extent, involved in the very design of the hall? You were consulted to some extent?
So backing up to when I got here, and the challenges when I got here, I learned early on that the Oscar Mayer was a very inferior space for classical music. I would say that a lot of our donors didn't know that because they sat up in the dress circle. And the sound in the dress circle was really excellent. But the sound underneath the balcony was frightening.
Yeah, notoriously so.
Frightening. And if anybody came there, sat there, they'd never come back. Because it sounded like, I won't.
Just kind of deadened, wasn't it?
It cut into the overtones of the orchestra so that they sounded horrifically out of tune. Ooh. Like the worst student orchestra you ever heard. It was unbelievable. And I went to an educational concert that I wasn't conducting. Beverly was conducting because I had something else. But I got back in time to see the performance. And I sat underneath the balcony, speakers in the ceiling, this horrifically out of tune orchestra. And I ran upstairs and sat in the mezzanine, and I thought it was a Carnegie Hall. Wow. Day and night. So then we thought, well, what do we do about that? So the first thing we did is we looked at the Orpheum. But the Orpheum has the same issue. So when we asked the acousticians to evaluate the Orpheum Theater, they said we can maybe get you from a 3 to a 5, but we'll never get you to a 10.
Well, the Orpheum is about 100 years old at this point.
Yeah, but it also has all those seats underneath the balcony. So it has a different scallop to the ceiling. It was more for live performance than the Capitol Theater, which was the name of the
Oscar Mayer originally. Yeah.
So then the stagehands used to call it Wiener Hall, and I used to call it Dog Hall because I thought it was really presented problems.
But you still wanted the buns in the seats.
Not in those seats. I used to go to marketing and I'd say, please don't sell those seats. Get them all upstairs and in the front. So anyway, then we found out that Pleasant was going to sell the American Girl doll, and that we knew that she was interested in the arts, and her help with getting the concerts on the square started,
Yes.
and and bringing people back downtown and all of that. And she sort of knew that people would come at her from all sides, once this got out that she was selling the company, she and her husband. So they jump-started the whole thing by suggesting that the executive directors of the different professional organizations get together and dream. What would you like? Who would your partners be? What would happen? And out of that, we at first at the Symphony thought we'd love to have a dedicated concert hall, which meant you could only do concerts. Well, the only partner we could have in that would use up enough nights in the year would be the University of Wisconsin. And they were playing in a 700-seat house, on campus. What's that called?
There's Mills.
Mills. They were playing in Mills before the new hall was built. And they sort of felt to be in an 1,850-seat concert hall with 500 people, they said if 500 people come to Mills, it looks like a sellout.
Right.
If 500 people come, so they weren't interested in partnering with us. So make a long story a little less long, our partners were going to be the same. It was going to be Broadway and it was going to be opera. So we wanted then a multi-purpose hall, but that had real acoustics for live music and would address the problems. So that's what came out of all of this, was the Overture Center of the Arts. And when Cesar Pelli was chosen to be the architect, I probably played a little bit of a role in that, because we knew we had money to build the hall. We were down to the final stages of choosing an architect. The Pacific Symphony out in Orange County wanted to build a hall, and they had engaged Cesar Pelli to be the architect, but they didn't have their money together yet. So I went to a fundraiser where Cesar Pelli spoke, and he talked about the fact that he never put a brick in place without consulting with an acoustician. And that was music to my ear.
Literally.
So I said, I let Pleasant know, that he had made that speech and that he had said that, and she liked him, and eventually that's who we got. I also think, to Bob D'Angelo's credit, who was running the Civic Center at the time, the Oscar Mayer, that we were kept abreast of all the stages of development. One of the things we did is we went to view other concert halls around the country, including one that Pelli had done in Charlotte, North Carolina, which was sort of a role model for the one that we have here. And then we went out to see my hall, because I was with Opera Pacific, out in Orange County. And when Pleasant saw that, and she saw how high-end the fixtures were and how beautiful it was, she wanted to Overture Hall to be beautiful and to have quality construction materials in it. And so that came out of that. We learned that the way to have a good acoustic for symphony orchestra is that there's no division between the stage and the audience, that the stage and the audience have to be in the same room. So you don't have a proscenium arch cutting off that sound. So when you go to Overture Hall and we're in concert setting, you see that the cantilevered ceiling goes right into the hall. And so that already is the secret to so many of the concert halls in Europe, that is for a first-rate acoustic. So we had that. And there's not a lot we can do in that hall because it's multi-purpose. We can expose drapes, we can part drapes we expose drapes mainly to absorb sound when we're rehearsing, so it's like the audience, and then we pocket them when we're actually there. So we learned all of that. But also, we were able to look at sight lines. We were able to look at all kinds of things. And, and I remember the first year in the hall, Rick Mackey, the brilliant, predecessor to our brilliant Robert Reed, did not sell those side box seats the first season. because he said, look, our public has no experience sitting on the side, and we've got to make sure those sight lines are okay. They were. You could see the whole stage, or almost the entire stage, sitting on the side. So those then became, coveted seats. So all of that kind of stuff, behind the scenes, and then, so when we went to see the hall in Charlotte, the back of it was a multi-purpose hall, and it was set up for symphony, and the back wall had organ pipes across, just like ours does, and so they had planned for an organ, but they had run out of money, so those pipes were faux. But we didn't. Pleasant gave us that organ.
Yes.
And I really thought, oh my God, if we could just have that organ, it'd be so much like a European concert hall. Well, Anne Stanke, who was running the opera at the time, dead set against it. She didn't want that organ in there.
Oh, well.
Because the wing space, while it was going to be more than the Oscar Mayer, it still was not going to be, if you go to the Kennedy Center and you go to stage right, it's as big as the stage. So you could put an entire act off to the side. The Met has it on both sides. I was in Kaohsiung in Taiwan earlier this year, and I went to see the art center there, and both sides of the stage for the opera house were the size of the opera house. So we didn't have that. So then, what do you do about we have a more sophisticated way of doing projections now, but rear screen projections at that time needed to be able to project. So you needed some depth back there. And the organ was going to eat up all of that rear space where the opera could store sets of the organ. So, I worked for both companies, right? So I just turned to blind. I said, Anne, we need the organ. We'll figure it out. And of course, the very first opera we did, Turandot, when that production came from Chicago Lyric in San Francisco, that was a ginormous production. And I remember that everybody was panicked that the sets weren't going to fit. There was no way we could get them in Overture Hall. And how we solved the problem? We built the sets up in the loading dock. We put trusses and we stored the scenery out in the loading dock and then just put it right in, and so we could do anything we wanted. So, but those were the early days. I mean, we were afraid. But then
you learn though, after a while.
And then the acoustic for the opera was so good. That was sort of like by default, really great. So we're so fortunate.
Well, it's been great, and I feel fortunate getting behind the scenes with you, John Demain.
Thank you.
So many moving parts, and we've learned a lot about them. And always great to hear you and see you in action.
Thank you.
I'm Norman Gilliland. I hope you'll join me next time around for University Place Presents.